It started as a joke, a harmless idea, or so I thought. My partner and I had been together for years, and while our relationship wasn't perfect, I never doubted our love. We had fallen into a routine, one that felt predictable, comfortable, and admittedly, a little boring at times. Date nights turned into evenings on the couch. Conversations revolved around work and errands, and the spark we once had seemed to flicker faintly in the background. One evening, over a glass of wine, I brought up the idea of spicing things up, adding a little excitement to our predictable routine. At first, it was just playful banter, a hypothetical conversation about fantasies, the kind you have when you feel completely safe with someone. It felt thrilling to talk about those things, to peel back layers of ourselves we hadn't shared before. We laughed, teased each other, and it seemed to bring a spark of energy we hadn't felt in a long time. Then the conversation turned more serious. My partner suggested we take it a step further, bring someone else into our dynamic, not permanently, just as a way to experiment. At first, I laughed it off. It sounded ridiculous, something people joked about but didn't actually do. But they kept talking about it, framing it as something fun, exciting, and even beneficial to us as a couple. They painted it as an adventure, a shared experience that would bring us closer. I was hesitant. The idea made me uncomfortable, but I didn't want to seem closed-minded or boring. My partner seemed so enthusiastic, so certain that this could be a good thing for us. Their excitement was contagious, and I began to wonder if maybe I was the one holding us back. Was I being too rigid? Too afraid to step out of my comfort zone? Over the next few days, I thought about it a lot. I kept coming back to one thing: I trusted my partner. We'd built our relationship on honesty and open communication, and I genuinely believed they had my best interests at heart. If they thought this was a good idea, maybe they were right. Eventually, I found myself agreeing. We set some ground rules and promised to communicate every step of the way. It felt like we were embarking on something bold and new, a way to reconnect and rediscover each other. I didn't realize then that I was opening a door I wouldn't be able to close, that what felt like a thrilling new chapter in our relationship would soon become the beginning of its end. The person we invited in wasn't a random stranger. It was someone we both knew, a mutual friend. I hadn't thought much about them beyond casual conversations and the occasional shared laugh at group gatherings. They were easygoing, approachable, and seemed to have a way of making everyone feel comfortable. To me, they were just part of our larger social circle, someone I trusted in the way you trust people who orbit your life without ever being truly close. When my partner suggested them, it felt strange at first. I had imagined if we went through with this, it would be with someone distant, someone who wouldn't linger in our lives after the fact. But my partner convinced me that this familiarity was a good thing. They argued it made everything less awkward, more natural. We already knew and liked this person, which, according to them, made it safer. They assured me this wasn't about feelings or attachments, it was about trust. And who better to trust than someone we already considered a friend? I didn't feel entirely comfortable, but I convinced myself that my discomfort was just nerves. After all, this was new territory for me. I wasn't the type to take big risks, especially in my relationship, but I told myself that stepping out of my comfort zone was a sign of growth. My partner seemed so confident, so sure that this was the right decision. I didn't want to seem like the insecure one, the person holding us back from something that could potentially be good for us. When we brought it up with our mutual friend, they were surprisingly open to the idea. Their casual attitude made me feel better about the whole thing. It was just fun to them, nothing serious, nothing to overthink. I tried to adopt that mindset too, pushing aside my doubts. I told myself this wasn't a big deal, that it was just an experiment, something we could try and then leave behind without any lasting impact. In the beginning, it seemed fine. We laid out clear boundaries, set expectations, and agreed on the importance of open communication. Everything felt planned, controlled, and, dare I say, exciting. It felt like we were on the same page, all three of us. My partner and I were taking this step together, and I was starting to believe their promises that this would bring us closer. But even in those early moments, there was a quiet voice in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. It whispered that this was risky, that I was handing over something sacred to people who might not hold it as carefully as I did. I silenced it, convinced that I was overthinking. This was just a shared adventure, a temporary escape from the mundane. What could possibly go wrong? It didn't take long for things to shift. At first, the changes were subtle, barely noticeable, the kind of things you could easily brush off if you weren't paying attention. They started with little moments, the way my partner and our mutual friend exchanged knowing looks during conversations, or how they would laugh at inside jokes that I didn't remember being part of. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into things. After all, we were all supposed to be comfortable with each other, weren't we? But as time went on, those moments became harder to ignore. My partner began texting them more often, sometimes late into the night. When I asked about it, they shrugged it off, saying it was nothing important, just casual chats about random topics. I wanted to believe them. I told myself that I was overreacting, that my insecurities were making me paranoid. I reminded myself of the promises we made, the boundaries we set. This was supposed to be a shared experience, something that brought us closer, not something that made me feel so isolated. Then came the excuses. My partner started canceling plans with me more frequently. It was always something reasonable, a work deadline, feeling tired, needing a bit of personal time. But I couldn't ignore the fact that they always seemed to have time for our mutual friend. Whether it was a quick coffee meetup or a casual hangout, they were suddenly spending more time together than I was with either of them. I began to feel like an outsider in my own relationship, watching from the sidelines as they grew closer in ways that didn't feel right. I tried to bring it up, but every time I did, I felt dismissed. My partner would reassure me that nothing was wrong, that I was worrying over nothing. I wanted to believe them so badly that I ignored the growing knot in my stomach, the feeling that something was slipping away from me. The final straw came when I saw them sharing a moment they didn't think I'd notice. It wasn't anything obvious, but it was enough. The way they stood too close, the way they leaned in when they thought no one was watching, it felt like a betrayal, even if I couldn't prove anything yet. The trust I'd taken for granted, the foundation we'd built our relationship on, began to crack. I found myself questioning everything: my partner, our friend, even myself. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure it could ever go back to the way it was. One evening, I stumbled upon the proof I didn't want to find. It was late, and my partner had gone to bed early, leaving their phone on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't have touched it, but something inside me couldn't let it go this time. That nagging feeling I'd been trying to ignore for weeks had grown too loud to silence. I told myself I wasn't snooping, I just needed reassurance, a sign that I was wrong, that my suspicions were unfounded. But as I scrolled through their messages, my worst fears were confirmed. The texts between my partner and our mutual friend weren't casual or innocent. They were filled with intimate words, secret plans, and inside jokes I wasn't part of. Reading them felt like a punch to the gut, each word cutting deeper than the last. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The person I trusted most had been lying to me, not just once, but over and over again. The betrayal was laid out in black and white, undeniable and devastating. They hadn't just crossed the boundaries we'd set, they had obliterated them. The messages revealed that what we'd agreed to as a shared experience had turned into something entirely different. This wasn't about us anymore, it was about them. The two of them had been sneaking around behind my back, meeting up in secret and building something that excluded me entirely. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I put the phone down, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. How long had this been going on? How could they look me in the eye and pretend everything was fine? Every memory of the past few weeks suddenly felt tainted, every moment replaying in my head with a new, painful clarity. When I finally confronted my partner, they denied it at first. They tried to downplay the messages, calling them harmless and saying I was overreacting. But there was no denying the evidence. I knew what I had seen, and no amount of excuses could erase the betrayal I felt. When they finally admitted the truth, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I couldn't look at them the same way anymore. Every word they spoke felt like another lie, another excuse to cover up what they had done. The person I thought I knew, the person I had built a life with, was gone, replaced by someone I couldn't trust. In that moment, the reality of the situation hit me. Our relationship was broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. The trust we had was gone, and with it, any hope of salvaging what we once had. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal that I could never forgive. Confronting them was the hardest thing I've ever done. I spent hours rehearsing the conversation in my head, trying to find the right words, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of it. When I finally sat them down and told them what I knew, their initial reaction was denial. They tried to brush it off to make me feel like I was imagining things or overreacting, but I stayed firm. I laid out the evidence, every text, every meeting they thought I wouldn't notice. They couldn't deny it anymore. When they finally admitted the truth, I didn't feel the relief I'd been expecting. Instead, I felt hollow, as if all the love and trust I'd poured into our relationship had been drained away in an instant. They apologized, of course. They said they hadn't meant for it to happen, that it had just gotten out of hand. But their words felt empty, like a desperate attempt to salvage something they knew they had destroyed. I knew I couldn't stay. As much as I loved them, as much as I wanted to believe their apologies, I couldn't ignore what they had done. This wasn't just a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a betrayal, not just of our relationship, but of the trust we had built over years. They had taken something sacred and used it as a foundation for their deceit, leaving me to pick up the pieces of what was left. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Ending the relationship wasn't just about walking away, it was about letting go of the future I thought we would have together. I had to grieve not only the loss of my partner, but also the version of myself who believed in them so completely. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I had made the right decision. But every time I felt that pull to go back, I reminded myself of the messages, of the way they had looked me in the eye and lied. I knew I deserved better. Moving on hasn't been easy. There are still days when I catch myself thinking about them, about what we had before everything fell apart. But I've learned to value myself in a way I never did before. I've learned that love isn't supposed to make you question your worth or feel like you have to compete for someone's attention. This experience has taught me a painful but important lesson: trust is fragile, and once it's broken, it can never truly be the same. I don't know what the future holds, but I know one thing for sure: I will never settle for anything less than the respect and honesty I deserve.